Wave splicing is a synthesis technique that's been gaining attention over the last few years. There's a few oscillators that are dedicated to it, including the Future Sound Systems Recombination Engine, the Dove Audio WTF or Window Transform Function Oscillator, and maybe the big daddy of them all, the Mach Wave Raiser. I wanted to show you how to try this technique using your own oscillators and also a couple ways to maybe extend it. Now, in addition to at least one oscillator, you're going to need at least one more module to pull off this technique, something that could switch between two audio waveforms quickly. A voltage control or sequential switch that you can clock at audio frequency will work. VCO makes a module called the Chopping Kinky, which is a good candidate. I personally prefer to use a crossfader that can work at audio rates, because not only will this allow you to do the traditional technique, it'll also allow you to extend it. I'm using a Happy Nerding Dual Xfade, and I find it works fine. So let's make some connections. You basically need at least three waveforms. One that will be one portion of your waveform, one that will be an alternate portion, and a third waveform that switches in between them. So for my first waveform, I'm just going to go ahead and take a sine wave from my spectrum oscillator here. I'm going to patch that into the A side of my crossfader. There we can hear it. Nice little fundamental harmonic. For my second waveform, I'm going to take something very simple to start, a sawtooth wave. I'm going to patch that output to the B side of my crossfader. I'm going to change my display so you can see a little bit more of these waveforms. There we go. Now with the crossfader, I can decide whether or not I hear the A waveform or the B waveform, or something in between. Now rather than change this knob manually, what I want to do is introduce a third waveform that will automatically do that crossfade for me at audio rates. I'm going to start by using the square wave out from the spectrum, because that will give me a hard switch from one waveform to another, and that is the traditional wave splicing technique. So I'll go ahead and take my splice here. You'll see it represented by that red waveform there. I'm going to take that output and run that to the control voltage input of my crossfader. Then I'm going to use the attenuator on my crossfader to fade up the strength of that till it is doing the crossfading for me. I'll go until I see the output waveform in yellow doesn't change anymore. That shows me that I'm at full strength. So now what I'm getting is a cross between that sawtooth wave and the sine wave. And I can change the mix by changing the pulse width. There I've got mostly sine wave with just a little bit of the sawtooth, until I fade all the way back to my sine wave. Just a slight harmonic contribution from the sawtooth you can see on the spectrum display, or go back to the sawtooth wave. The discontinuity where the two waveforms were spliced together creates its own additional harmonics in the mix. Now in addition to playing with that manually, I can take something automatic like an LFO, patch it to my pulse width modulation, and have it automatically do my crossfade for me. Maybe increase the depth here. Gives me an animated wave there. Or I could even envelope it, take the output of my envelope generator, adjust my pulse width to be mostly one wave to start, and let triggers on my keyboard perform that crossfade for me. So I have an animated waveform with basically one oscillator. It's kind of a cross between pulse width modulation and a little bit of a sync sound. I'm going to pull that for now. Go back to my LFO so I can use that later on. And return back to my center fade in between the two waveforms. I can mix different waveforms together, such as say the sine and a triangle, sine and a suboctave, or this mutant waveform that the spectrum happens to offer. But things get really interesting when you start to introduce other oscillators that are detuned from each other. Then you start to get some traveling and some motion in this sound. For example, instead of taking my sawtooth wave from the spectrum, let's take it from the Mother 32's sawtooth wave. Get to my saw out up here. By being slightly detuned, I'm getting this interesting phasing effect right around where that transition is from one waveform to the other. Again, I can go to the Moog sawtooth, mostly the sine wave from the spectrum with just a slight modulation of that traveling sawtooth. Or again, some automatic modulation. Now I have these slightly detuned, but of course I can introduce additional tunings such as octave offsets, or even offset by an interval such as a fifth. Now to make it even more interesting, I can introduce a third oscillator with its own tuning to go ahead and do that switch independent of the tuning of the two waves contributing to the final. I'm going to just go ahead and take my slice waveform here and move it over to the square wave output of a third oscillator, the distinct. And again, I can go ahead and tune it to, say, different octaves, a higher slice. Go ahead and put the Moog on a fifth interval. And I have a much more complex waveform by slicing two different oscillators with the rate of a third oscillator. Now this is the classic chopping technique. Let's go ahead and take things back down to some nice known starting point here. As a matter of fact, I'll go ahead and use the spectrum sawtooth just to simplify things. Since I'm using a crossfader, I don't need to use a square wave to switch in between these two contributing waveforms. I could use another wave shape to actually crossfade rather than just switch. For example, the distinct has a sawtooth that can be bent into a triangle wave. I'm going to switch over to that for my modulation source. Now I have a much more gentle, less buzzy sound because the transitions are much more gentle between the two waveforms. There's not a sudden hard switch. I can go ahead and modulate that as well. Go up to its Y input in this particular algorithm. And again, I can still use different waveforms. Sine and triangle, sine in this mutant waveform that the spectrum makes available, suboctave, that nice low throb here is coming from the LFO, and again to compare, if I was using a square wave for that switch, now I have this really heavy sound, very noisy, lots of harmonics. And that might be actually better for something I do with the keyboard. Let's go ahead and pull my cutoff down. Yeah, up in that register's better. That's a very rich sound. But if I was doing something like a drone, I might prefer something that has softer crossfade. Change this mutant waveform, which also allows me to change its wave shape. So that's the basic wave slicing technique extended. Two source waveforms, the green and blue waveforms that you see here on the data's display. Switch between them using something like a crossfader, my favorite tool. Use a third waveform, start out with a square wave to slice in between them, but also try different waveforms, particularly ones that you can morph to go ahead and change the crossfade between those waveforms. Here I'm just using a very simple sine wave to mutant sawtooth. But you could try other waveforms to perform that crossfade. You could use a morphing wavetable, the output of a wave folder, etc., to create more subtle harmonic blends in between your donor waveforms. And that's the cool thing about Modular. You can patch up many of these techniques and go ahead and extend them in your own personal way.